The streets of Depression-era Cleveland were already bleak enough before the bodies started appearing. In September 1935, the first victims were discovered in what would become one of America's most notorious unsolved serial killer cases, the Cleveland torso murders. As an investigator who spent years studying this case, I can tell you that what happened in Kingsbury Run still sends chills through law enforcement circles today. Picture, if you will, a young man walking along the edge of Kingsbury Run, a poverty-stricken area that served as a makeshift camp for the homeless during the Great Depression. On that September morning, he stumbled upon something that would change Cleveland forever: the lower half of a woman's torso, washed clean and drained of blood. The precision of the cuts suggested someone with medical knowledge or butchering experience. This was just the beginning. The victim was never identified, but she would later be known as the Lady of the Lake. The killer had gone to extraordinary lengths to prevent identification, removing the head, limbs, and any identifying marks from the body. This would become his signature, a grotesque calling card that would haunt the city for years to come. Just a few days after this discovery, police found the upper half of the torso several miles away. The level of decomposition suggested the killer had kept the parts preserved somehow before disposing of them. This wasn't just murder. This was someone who took pleasure in the dismemberment, someone who spent time with their victims even after death. By January 1936, 2 more victims appeared, both male this time. Edward Andrassy and an unidentified man were found in almost identical conditions, decapitated, dismembered, and carefully drained of blood. Andrassy was the first victim to be identified, a 28-year-old hospital orderly known to frequent the seedier parts of Cleveland. His identification should have been a breakthrough, but it only deepened the mystery. The killer seemed to be targeting society's outcasts, the homeless, the unemployed, those who wouldn't be immediately missed. This made the investigation particularly challenging, as many victims remained unidentified. They were the invisible people of the Depression, those who lived in the shanty towns and hobo camps that dotted Kingsbury Run. Enter Eliot Ness. Yes, that Eliot Ness, the same man who helped bring down Al Capone. By 1935, he was Cleveland's safety director, and these murders became his personal obsession. Ness was known for his methodical approach and incorruptible nature, but this case would test him like no other. The summer of 1936 brought more victims. Florence Polillo, a 42-year-old prostitute, was found dismembered and scattered across several locations in the city. Unlike previous victims, Polillo had a fixed address and a name. She was known to police, and her identification should have provided valuable leads. But again, the killer left no traces, no witnesses, nothing to connect the dots. The killer's method was becoming clearer with each victim. They were usually killed by decapitation, though some showed signs of being alive when the dismemberment began. The cutting was precise, suggesting someone with anatomical knowledge. The bodies were always cleaned meticulously, drained of blood, and sometimes showed signs of chemical preservation. By 1937, the panic in Cleveland was palpable. People avoided Kingsbury Run after dark. The homeless population, terrified of becoming the next victim, began leaving the area in droves. The press dubbed the killer the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, and the name stuck. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the killer's apparent ability to keep victims for extended periods before disposing of them. Some victims showed signs of having been dead for weeks or even months before being discovered, yet the parts were remarkably well preserved. This suggested the killer had access to a private space and the means to store bodies, perhaps even a cold storage facility. In July 1937, the case took an even more bizarre turn. A victim was found directly beneath Eliot Ness's office window at the Cleveland Police Headquarters. It seemed like a taunt, a direct challenge to the man leading the investigation. Ness took it personally, and his obsession with catching the killer intensified. The investigation explored every possible angle. They looked into medical students, butchers, morticians, anyone who might have the skills to perform such precise cuts. They investigated local hospitals and meatpacking plants. They even brought in early forensic experts, but the killer left nothing behind. No fingerprints, no hair, no fibers. One promising suspect emerged, Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, a veteran of World War I who had worked as a medical orderly. He had the medical knowledge, and his cousin was a congressman who had opposed Ness's appointment as safety director. Sweeney voluntarily submitted to police questioning and even took 2 primitive lie detector tests. The results suggested he was lying when he denied involvement in the murders. However, Sweeney had powerful political connections, and there wasn't enough physical evidence to charge him. He would later commit himself to a mental hospital, where he remained until his death in 1965. During his stay, he would reportedly send taunting postcards to Eliot Ness, though these were never definitively proven to be from him. The last official torso murder victim was found in 1938, though some researchers believe the killer continued his work elsewhere. In total, there were 12 official victims, though some estimates suggest there could have been as many as 20. Only 3 were ever identified. The case took its toll on Eliot Ness. His reputation as the incorruptible lawman who brought down Capone meant nothing in the face of this invisible killer. He would later leave Cleveland for a series of unsuccessful business ventures, eventually dying in relative obscurity in 1957. The Cleveland torso murders remain unsolved to this day, but their impact on American crime history is undeniable. They represented one of the first major serial killer investigations in the United States, predating more famous cases like the Zodiac Killer by decades. The case helped establish many of the investigative techniques that would later become standard in serial killer investigations. Perhaps most chillingly, the case demonstrated how someone could commit a series of brutal murders in a major American city and simply vanish, leaving behind nothing but questions and dismembered bodies. It showed how a killer could exploit society's blind spots, targeting those on the margins, those who wouldn't be missed. The areas where the bodies were found have changed dramatically since the 1930s. Kingsbury Run is now crossed by highways and industrial developments. The shanty towns are long gone. But the mystery remains, locked in police files and newspaper archives, a reminder of a time when Cleveland was terrorized by a killer who turned murder into a macabre art form. The case continues to fascinate true crime researchers and historians, not just for its brutality, but for what it reveals about American society during the Depression. It shows how economic hardship created perfect hunting grounds for predators, how social inequality could shield a killer from justice, and how even legendary lawmen like Eliot Ness could be brought low by an adversary who seemed to understand exactly how to exploit the system's weaknesses. In the end, the Cleveland torso murderer joins the ranks of Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac as killers, who not only escape justice, but seem to mock society's attempts to catch them. Their identities remain hidden in the shadows of history, their secrets taken to the grave, leaving behind only questions and the haunting possibility that they lived out their lives among us, undetected and unpunished.